Hello everyone, my name is Anthony Benning and I'm a professor of English at a community college where I primarily teach British literature and first-year composition classes. In this video, I'd like to talk about audience and purpose. Before starting a writing project, or if you're just getting started with a writing project, audience and purpose are the two things that you really do need to consider before you can even start researching, start outlining, start drafting, starting anything. They're the basis of everything. And so in this video, I'd like to provide some tips on what to consider when it comes to audience and purpose to hopefully help you narrow down the focus of your writing and also to help you with getting started in the writing project. First, I would like to introduce a term to my students, and that term is rhetoric. So rhetoric is just a fancy term for the tools that we use or the choices that we make in a writing situation or in a speaking situation. Essentially, anytime that we try to communicate an idea or try to persuade someone to do something or just try to get someone to validate an idea that we have, we are using rhetoric. So rhetoric is something that we use every day. Anytime that you are trying to communicate an idea, you are using rhetoric. And so rhetoric is just the tools or the choices that we make in order to communicate an idea. Anytime that you're doing something even as simple as telling a friend a joke, you had to make a series of choices. The goal was to get them to laugh or to help reinforce or maintain a friendship. The choice is in the joke that you choose or the story that you tell to try and get them a laugh. You've made choices based on your knowledge of your audience. You know your audience, and so you know it's going to laugh. Anytime you share a meme, share a joke that you think is going to produce a specific effect, that was a rhetorical choice. And so the same thing happens when you're doing something a lot more formal than sharing a joke or sharing a TikTok video. It happens in communication and writing courses. You are given a task, and now you have to make a series of choices on how to complete that task. All of that kind of lumps under the category of rhetoric. Now, let's talk about purpose. Purpose is the why. Why are you writing? Most of the time, for most of my students, it's because they've been given an assignment and they're hoping to complete that assignment to achieve a grade, so that way hopefully they can prepare for the final project in that assignment and then pass the class and move on to the next class. And for most college students, there are three types or major types of writing situations that they probably are going to come across. And that can be informative, argumentative and persuasive, or analytical. Those are the three primary writing situations that most students are going to find themselves in. An informative writing assignment means that you're probably just going to be repeating material that you have come into contact with the course, or maybe your instructor has asked you to go out and do some research and to report back on what you have found. You're not, in those situations, you're not trying to analyze anything, you're not trying to present an argument or trying to persuade, you are just trying to inform. You're just essentially repeating information that you have found, either through content that has been given to you in an assignment or through your own research. In an analytical piece, you are being asked to basically take something apart, describe its pieces and how those pieces all relate to each other and work together to create the whole. It's essentially like basically taking an engine from a car, pulling it apart, and being able to tell somebody how every single part contributes to the function of that engine. You're doing the same thing whenever it is you go to a piece of writing, a piece of media, a piece of literature, and you're basically taking it apart, showing each of the pieces in that piece of text that you are analyzing and showing them how all of them work together to create the whole, or to help whoever it is created it to whatever choices they made to hopefully achieve whatever goal that they had. In argumentative and persuasive writing, students are usually trying to either persuade someone to do something, or they're trying to argue that their point is valid. And they want the other side to actually see from their perspective, either to change their opinion on something or to just recognize the validity of the argument or the idea. That's what you'll be doing in an argumentative or persuasive essay or assignment. So when you're looking at an assignment, try to determine whether or not that assignment is designed to be informative, persuasive, and argumentative, or whether it's going to be analytical. Asking your professor which one of those three it's going to be, or if there's another kind of option that they are opting for, is going to be very helpful. It is helpful because it allows you to know what to do or how to plan ahead. If you're just being informative, then you're not going to have to try and argue a specific point or do sustained analysis. But if it's argumentative, then you need to actually have a point. You need to have a persuasive kind of angle, or you're trying in some way, as opposed to just being informative. And it's a lot of things that my students in my first year composition classes usually get mixed up. They get so lost in the research that they usually end up repeating just what other people have said and not really contributing anything to the conversation when I'm asking them to create an argument. So knowing the purpose of the writing situation, or in terms of what you're expected to accomplish, is incredibly helpful, and it will help you meet the expectations of that assignment. Now, when we're talking about audience is who you are writing to. Now, in the case of the example that I gave earlier about the friend that you wanted to make laugh, your friend is your audience. And as I mentioned earlier, in the telling of a joke, or even the selection of the joke, and even the way that you told it, was designed with your audience, with your friend in mind. That's your audience. In a college classroom, an audience is going to be primarily your professor, though there could be situations where you will be writing to your peers. But for the most part, your professor is going to be the one who ends up grading the assignment, and so you are going to be needing to write to your professor. Outside of college classrooms, you may be writing to employers, you may be writing to coworkers. Essentially, at least in my first year composition class, even though I know a lot of my students are probably not going to be writing formal essays once they get outside of my class, or even when they get into their career, they are going to be learning how to write in a professional setting, or write in a way that sounds professional or gives them the appearance of professionalism. And so there's a couple of things you can definitely think about when it comes to your audience, or at least I have students who usually ask this question of like, well, how do I know what my audience is expecting? First, you can make a couple of base assumptions. If you are taking a college class, then you should know that your audience is going to be educated, and that the threshold for things like evidence and the credibility of evidence and the professionalism that you adopt in your writing is going to be a lot higher. So there's going to be a lot of major differences between, say, for example, what you might try to say or argue with your friends and family, to then it is to your professor or the teacher of your class. So you know that the audience is going to be educated, and you're probably going to need to produce a lot more credible research. So for example, the old standard by now is that students should not rely on something like Wikipedia for their research. And the reason for that is because Wikipedia, the information in Wikipedia is not bad. It can definitely be useful in other contexts with, say, for example, friends, family, or even informal assignments, or other informal situations. But with your professor, that's not really going to work, because Wikipedia is considered to be an untrustworthy source. So it hasn't been vetted, and it can be changed a lot. And that's one of the reasons why it's not typically accepted in a college classroom. So that is something you can definitely assume. Another thing that I typically see with my students is my students will oftentimes provide definitions of words. And definitions can kind of help them get started, or help jumpstart the writing process. So once they get the words on the page, it makes it a little bit easier to continue writing. And so definitions can be useful in that regard. However, there are usually very rarely any instances where you would need to define words for your professor. So if you're writing to an educated audience, then you're really not going to need to define common words. There's only two times where you might want to define a word, and that is if the word itself is obscure or rare, and so you can't really expect the reader to be familiar with the term, or when you want to take that definition, you want to challenge it, and you want to redefine the word. Those are probably the only two instances where you need to do that. So once again, the audience is an educated audience, and so that's something that you can safely assume, and so you need to adjust your level of writing to match that audience. Next, because you know this is a formal audience, you will need to adopt a more formal or professional tone. So this can be things like, for example, avoiding contractions, maybe not using second-person pronouns like you and your. It can also mean avoiding slang and in other informal expressions. In the end, the best thing to do is simply just to ask your professor. Your audience is going to have specific kind of expectations, and while I may have my own expectations in terms of what I expect my students to write and to how they sound and what my own preferences are, even within my field of English, there are going to be some differences as you move from professor to professor. The same thing goes if you move out of the field. So one of the things you can definitely do is use your professor or use your instructor as a resource. Ask them what their personal preferences are when it comes to writing. If he had an English instructor who preferred writing in a specific with specific characteristics, ask your new professor if those characteristics are acceptable, or maybe they might have something else. It's always good to just go ahead and just ask your professor. So yes, while your audience, you can make some base assumptions about your audience given the situation that you're in, especially if you're in a college classroom, you can always just simply ask. And most of the time, most professors that I've ever encountered will be thrilled to hear from you. Yeah, you may get that occasional professor who maybe not quite so nice. But even in those situations, it doesn't hurt for you to be active in your learning process. So even if you do get rejected or if you don't get the answer or the help that you were hoping to get, you still acted and you are active in your learning process, and that is going to benefit you in the long run. And so to close, just remember that when you're starting out with a writing project, you do need to consider the purpose of the writing project and also the audience. Once you consider those things, it can help you narrow down what you need to do and to help you meet the expectations of the assignment. Thank you for watching, and I wish you a good day and good writing.